Have you ever been lost? Do you feel like you've been lost lately? Do you feel like you've lost sight of who or what you're supposed to be? You feel utterly aimless, like you're floating in whichever way the wind takes you. Perhaps you have been described as a lost cause, or you've described somebody else as a lost cause. When you feel lost, you feel utterly helpless. I remember reading a story about a camper who went wild camping on her own for the first time. During the middle of the night, she got out of her tent to go and have a wee in the darkness, but she didn't take a torch with her. She thought that the distance that she would go from the tent would be absolutely fine. Well, after she'd done her business, when she turned round and started walking towards the direction that she thought her tent was in, she discovered it wasn't there any longer. As time went on, she searched aimlessly for her tent, getting more scared and scared and scared, with her anxiety building up inside her. It took her 3 hours before she was able to find her tent again. You can imagine during that time all of the different things which would have been going through her head. Maybe I was too self-confident. Maybe I shouldn't be here in the first place. I wasn't prepared. I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. Maybe I was just simply too inexperienced. Being lost is a key theme in the Bible, especially related to God's people. Time and again, God's chosen people found themselves exiles, strangers in foreign lands. During such a time, God described his people like lost sheep. He said, "Their shepherds have led them astray and turned them loose in the mountains. They have lost their way and can't remember how to get back to the sheepfold." The Bible witnesses time and again the human condition of being utterly, hopelessly lost. Here in the last few chapters of Samuel, we learn about the final demise of Saul, his death. Saul, who was the first king of Israel, chosen by his people, anointed by the Spirit of God, God's Ruach, anointed by God's own prophet Samuel. Here we are at the end of his reign, and the book of Samuel paints a sad picture of the jealous, paranoid, and ultimately hopelessly lost King Saul of Israel. Saul wasn't lost in the wilderness like the lady that was looking for her tent. Instead, he was lost in the everyday life. He couldn't find God's dwelling place in his heart. Instead, he wandered in the dark, going around in circles, never quite making it to the honoured place that God had enabled for him, to his resting place within God's presence. It is in the end of his story, after the prophet Samuel's death, that we see how far away from God Saul ultimately was. It is a sad ending to what God's people had hoped would be the beginning of a great new story. Let's find out about the events which led up to King Saul's death, as Mark reads to us from the book of 1 Samuel.
1 Samuel 28, verses 3 to 11. Meanwhile, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him. He was buried in Ramah, his hometown, and Saul had banned from the land of Israel all mediums and those who consult the spirits of the dead. The Philistines set up their camp at Sohim, and Saul gathered all the army of Israel, and camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. He asked the Lord what he should do, but the Lord refused to answer him, either by dreams or by sacred lots, or by the prophets. Saul then said to his advisers, "Find a woman who is a medium, so I can go ask her what she wants to do." His advisers replied, "There is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself by wearing an ordinary clothing instead of his royal robes. Then he went to the woman's home at night, accompanied by 2 of his men. "I have to talk to a man who has died," he said. "Will you call up his spirit for me?" "Are you trying to get me killed?" the woman demanded. "You know what Saul has outlawed for all the mediums and all who consult the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me?" But Saul took an oath in the name of the Lord and promised, "As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you for doing this." Finally, the woman called and said, "Whose spirit do you want me to call up?" "Call up Samuel," Saul replied.
After Samuel's death, King Saul was desperate. The Spirit of the Lord was no longer on him, and on top of that, he was harbouring evil spirits. And yet he knew in his heart that the only right way, was the way of Yahweh. But he had lost him. He didn't know what direction to go in to find him. The threat of his age-old adversary, the Philistines, still loomed, and he wanted to know what to do. He wanted to ask God, "What do I do in this situation?" But sadly, demonstrating how far from God Saul had fallen, he resorted to the use of a medium, a witch, tricking her into raising Samuel's spirit from the afterlife, from Sheol. Previously, Saul had driven out all of the sorcerers, all of his people that dabbled in this dark, evil arts out of the land. And here was King Saul pretending to be somebody else as he used one of the mediums to try to bring Samuel up from the grave so that he could find out which way he should go. That is how utterly, hopelessly lost King Saul felt. Saul wasn't even lost in the wilderness. He had all the resources of a king, and he'd previously enjoyed an honoured relationship with Yahweh. He knew how powerful God is, and yet by this point he'd become so disorientated that he resorted to witchcraft, to using evil spirits. King Saul was lost, and tragically he would die lost. It makes you wonder, what do you need when you are lost? Well, perhaps the first thing that we need is a map. You see, a map provides you detailed information on where you want to go, where you've come from, and what the terrain has been or will be like. I love the outdoors, and I have enjoyed being trained in being able to take people safely into the wilderness so that they know what to do no matter what conditions are thrown at them. You quickly discover that map reading is the essential, if not the number one skill in this environment. Imagine a 1-week assessment where every day you are going constantly on walks, somebody's looking over your shoulder, several times an hour they're asking you, "Where are we?" You need to point with the most delicate pointing device, usually a blade of grass, to show precisely where you are on that map. They may then ask, "Where are we going? Where have we come from? How long will it take to get to that point? Show me where you are." It isn't easy. It's a grueling process being able to try to ensure that you know exactly where you are on the map at all times. I remember one time when I was out on a walk on my own, and it was a foggy day, and I was out in territory that I wasn't familiar with, but I felt like the route that I was following was fairly straightforward. I was making my way up onto the ridge of a hill, and all I needed to do was walk uphill, which seems fairly straightforward, and when I reached the top of the hill, there was the fence post as remains of an old fence. As soon as I hit the fence post, all I needed to do was go left, and then I would be able to follow that fence across the ridge in the direction that I wanted to go. So that's what I did. I went up this hill, I found these fence posts, and I started following left. But then after a while, as I'd walked for maybe a good half hour or so, I started getting a little bit twitchy, a little bit uneasy that actually, as I looked at my map, what the terrain was telling me in real life compared to what the terrain was supposed to be on the map, it just wasn't adding up. Something seemed to have gone wrong. You might say that I was lost, that maybe I was like King Saul, wandering around, never quite making it to where I should be going. However, in this situation, I wasn't lost. I had taken an unexpected detour, because what happened is in the fog, somehow, at some point walking up the hill and finding the fence line, I must have gone in a slight loop. And when I did find this fence post and I followed it left, I actually ended up going in the opposite direction to what I should have been going. When I realized that something wasn't quite right, I was able to bring out another tool which is also essential when navigating during difficult terrains, when navigating in the wilderness. And this tool is, of course, a compass. And it was with a compass that I was able to check which direction I was going, to realize my error and reorientate myself so that I could start traveling along the ridge in the correct direction and find myself once again onto familiar terrain. Eventually, King Saul, he no longer had a map or a compass. He didn't even have to be in the wilderness, in the thick fog, in order to find himself being utterly lost. David, on the other hand, by this point, he also seemed lost. It really doesn't seem that good for either Saul or David. And David, unlike Saul, seemed to be lost in the wilderness. Saul's relentless pursuit of David has driven David and his mercenary army into the Philistines to find protection. Like a band of outlaws, they acted as mercenaries for hire. He lived within the land of the Philistines for over a year, amongst Israel's enemies, amongst his enemies. It seemed like if anybody needed a map and compass, that it was David. Let's find out about one of the incidents that David had during this time when he was in the wilderness.
1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 to 4 and 8 to 12. But David kept thinking to himself, "Someday Saul is going to get me. The best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory, and I will finally be safe." So David took his 600 men and went over and joined Achish, son of Maoch, the king of Gath. David and his men and their families settled there in Achish at Gath. David brought his 2 wives with him, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, Nabal's widow from Carmel. Word soon reached Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he stopped hunting for him. David and his men spent their time raiding the Gerzites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, people who had lived near Shur, toward the land of Egypt, since ancient times. David did not leave one person alive in the villages he attacked. He took the sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys, camels, and clothing before returning home to see King Achish. "Where did you make your raid today?" Achish would ask. And David would reply, "Against the south of Judah, the Jeremites and the Canaanites." No one was left alive to come to Gath and tell where he had really been. This happened again and again while he was living among the Philistines. Achish believed David and thought to himself, "By now the people of Israel must hate him bitterly. Now he will have to stay here and serve me forever."
I'm sure many of you by now have probably seen the little video that Andrew and I had put together of Andrew's first walk in the Monroes just a couple of weekends together. And just at the end of this walk together, we got to the top of a little summit after going off path, and we decided that we would cut down to a track which would eventually lead us to the car. We were pretty much at the end of our walk and everyone was pretty knackered. At the top of this ridgeline, I took a rough sort of like guide of exactly where we were on the ridge and took a bearing, which is where you point the compass into the direction of where we were hoping to go. I knew that there was a stream which was going to be following roughly in the direction of the track, so I took a bearing towards the track, but also ensuring that if we missed the track in any way, that we would end up on the stream and still be able to follow that to ultimately identify this track. So off we went off this ridge, heading in the correct general direction. And as we went down this hill, what started as short grass at the top and little heather soon turned into knee length, if not thigh length at times heather, with lots of tussocks which are like lumps of grass. So you're constantly finding places for your feet and then discovering that actually there's a bit of a hole down there. It was tough work. We were literally bushwhacking. I thought the track would be there before we know it, but it felt like we'd been bushwhacking for ages. It turns out that we did miss the track slightly, and as we came down by the stream, we had to follow alongside this stream in these difficult conditions, wondering if this track will ever be discovered, if we will come across this track which will take us back to our car. This was a situation where, again, people may feel like they're lost, but in reality, we weren't lost because we were heading in the right direction, even though once again we took a little detour. And when I think about that experience, it makes me think about David, because I think David is in a similar situation when we find him here in the book of Samuel. Although it might seem like David is lost in the wilderness of the Philistines, that he's resorted to just be a mercenary outlaw, doing what he can to keep himself and his men surviving, if you look carefully at his exploits, you may realize that things are not quite what they seem. Because in fact, the groups that David's men fought were often carefully selected. They were the enemies of the Philistines, yes, but also most importantly, these groups were shared enemies with the tribes of Judah. That is Israel, David's people. After defeating such groups, David would present gifts to the leaders of the tribes of Judah as signs of their alliance and a demonstration of his power. Such gifts would not be accepted lightly, because taking them would show a public allegiance to David and also a recognition of his authority. Even whilst David was in the wilderness with the Philistines, the actions that David was taking were very calculated and were still for the good, ultimately, of his people. David's map was clear. Every move that he made highlighted the destination that he was aiming for. But in such a complex situation, how did he know which way to go? And most importantly, when was the most appropriate time to act or not act? Well, he knew where to go and when to act because the Lord was his compass. Literally, while Saul was evoking the dark powers of sorcery, David was asking the Lord, in which direction should I go? In a particular situation where all of the his armies supporting wives and young people were all captured by the Amalekites, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord, "Should I chase after the band of raiders? Will I catch them?" And the Lord told him, "Yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken away from you." David, during his time in the wilderness, he learned that feeling lost can redirect us towards what really matters most to us. Certainly, this is something which so many people have experienced during today's unprecedented situation, that it is during this time when people have felt utterly lost and helpless that they've begun to appreciate what is really important to them in life. Being lost can make us realize that perhaps we aren't as lost as what we thought we are. Yes, certainly we may be requiring a bit of help to point us in the right direction. But finding that help that we need can sometimes be easier than what we might originally think. In fact, that help might be right in front of our faces. David learned that when you are lost, that there's no better person to put your faith in than our Lord, God. God who recognizes when we are lost and does not abandon us. He says, "I will search for my lost ones who strayed away, and I will bring them safely home. I will bandage the injured and strengthen the weak." Today, we have been given all the tools so that we can find direction in life. It is in the Bible that we find our map. Through the lives of the map makers, the cartographers, we learn where we have come from, where we are going, and what the terrain will look like. But like any map, it is only half of what we need for our journey. It is only in the Spirit, our compass, that we might find our direction and reorientate our hearts towards God. When Saul was chosen as Israel's first king, although God knew he wasn't the king that they needed, he helped his people anyway. God gave Saul all of the tools that he needed for his journey. As we mourn the passing of Saul in our study, in our series, we might recognize his glimmers of brilliance, which was demonstrated in his final resting place. In the end, Saul died on his own sword, so that he would not succumb to the excruciating and humiliating mutilation that the Philistines were known to do to kings that they'd been victorious over. Even after Saul had killed himself, his lifeless body was abused and mutilated. It was fastened to a wall for all to see. It was a non-Israelite tribe of Jabesh Gilead that, hearing of Saul's treatment, of how his lifeless body was hanging off a wall, that they gathered together their best men and they travelled through the night to take Saul's body down, burying it under a tamarisk tree, like the one that he was anointed as king. This tribe gave great honour to Saul as they remembered the king, who early on in his reign we'll find in 1 Samuel 11, when God's Spirit rushed upon him, he saved their people from the Ammonite threat. You see, the Bible is like a mirror. All the characters are reflected in the reality of their lives, their ups and their downs. We would do well in their reflections not to lose sight of all that the characters have done. Because it's by looking at the full portrait of King Saul that we might realise how tragically sad a story King Saul is. In many respects, King Saul was just a man like us, who, like many of us, ultimately lost his map and his compass. In Saul, Israel chose a king, but he was not the king that they ultimately needed. We can learn from Saul that we too have been given the tools for our journeys, but now it is our responsibility to use them. So next we're going to sing a couple of songs as we reflect on what it means to depend on God, what it means to take direction from God in our lives. We're going to sing Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow, and then Be Thou My Vision, literally be our path as God guides us on our journey. After that, there's 2 songs, the service will be finished and we'll be able to meet together for a chat over Zoom. But before then, I would just like to close us in a benediction, which is called The Power of God, which was from St. Patrick. May the strength of God pilot us. May the power of God preserve us. May the wisdom of God instruct us. May the hand of God protect us. May the word of God direct us. May the shield of God defend us. May the host of God guard us against snares of evil and the temptations of the world. Amen.